You're listening to the World Food Prize Podcast, dialogue that feeds the world. Twice a month, we bring you inspiring conversations with the leaders, innovators, and changemakers working to increase food and nutrition security. From groundbreaking research to global initiatives, we explore the ideas and actions driving food and nutrition security, sustainability, and opportunity for all. Join us as we uncover solutions, share stories, and work toward a more food and nutrition secure future. The Wellmark Foundation is proud to present the World Food Prize Podcast as part of our commitment to improving the health of all Iowans and South Dakotans. Access to nutritious food is essential for living a long, healthy life, and this partnership underscores the importance of advancing a food and nutrition secure future for all.
Hello, this is Mashal Hussain, President of the World Food Prize Foundation. And before we get started with today's podcast, I want to invite you to something very special and meaningful to our foundation. On Friday, May 15th, we're celebrating the 15th anniversary of our global headquarters, our home, the Norman E. Borlaug Hall of Laureates in downtown Des Moines. The evening is much more than a gala. It's a chance to help preserve one of Iowa's most inspiring and iconic historic landmarks, and to support our mission of advancing global food security. We'd love for you to join us for our exciting casino night called High Stakes and Higher Purpose. You can learn more about this fun evening and get tickets at worldfoodprize.org/gala. The World Food Prize team and I hope to see you there. Thank you for celebrating with us and enjoy the podcast.
Please welcome Fred P. Hochberg and your host, World Food Prize Foundation CEO, Thomas Vilsack.
Fred, it's really kind of you to spend a few minutes with us today on the podcast, and excited to visit with you because you've literally written the book on trade, and I want to get into that. But before we do, I want to take you back into your early childhood and ask you the question, when you were a young fella, did you think you'd be writing a book on trade? Did you think you would be engaged in trade as sort of a critical component of your background? What is it that you thought you would be doing when you were 10 or 11 years old?
So, well, first of all, Tom, I could never say no to you, so I'm thrilled to be here and happy to have this conversation. I grew up, my family, my dad's family came to America in the early 20th century. My mom's family emigrated here from Germany and arrived in 1937. And both sides of the family were business people. My dad had sort of a dry goods store when there was such a thing. And my mother's father, my grandfather on my mother's side, had a small manufacturing company. Actually made leather pocketbooks, belts, wallets, things like that. And just quickly, my mom was the designer for his business. She would go to the better stores. In those days, Lord & Taylor was still around, and she would find things that were really attractive. She had a great eye. And frankly, she and my grandfather, the unflattering word is they would knock them off, or I would say they reinterpreted them for a more budget-conscious consumer. So that's how it all got started. So I think even when I was like 10 years old, I would get things from my mother and father's company that were rejects, like seconds, and I would sell them on our side porch. And I remember I used one of my mother's old pocketbooks to store all the stuff, and I called it Hochberg Industries. I had great ambition. And so I would be selling this stuff, I don't know, 10, 25 cents, whatever, small amounts. But so I think that was just inculcated from day one that, that you be a business person and in the trading area. So did I ever think I'd write a book? Never in a million years. And when people suggested it, when I left the Obama administration, I said, no, I've written op-eds, but a book, that's a big enterprise. And I was very fortunate. After I left serving the government, President Obama with you at the same time, I got a fellowship at the University of Chicago at their Institute of Politics. I got one at Harvard University Theater Institute of Politics, and you have to teach a course. So I said, well, what could the course be? And I came up with the idea, trade is not a four-letter word, because I thought college students, if I said we're going to reset America's trade agenda in the 21st century, everybody would go to sleep. So I came up with this idea for a class and brought in outside speakers every week. And it turns out the students kept saying, and speakers said, this sounds like a great book. You're going to write a book? And I went, no, I'm not going to write a book. But 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I kept getting the same question. So I decided to explore that, and to my surprise, wrote a book, and I was happy I did. It was a great experience. I learned so much in writing the book, and it introduced me to so many people, and I was Simon & Schuster published it. It's been 2 printings and paperback, and so it was a great experience.
Well, obviously, we'll be able to talk about trade in the book here in just a minute. But let's build up your resume to be able to actually write a book with some degree of authority. That small business operation, Hochberg Industries, that you started as a young fella, did that morph into the Lillian Vernon company, or was that somebody else's invention?
No, that was my mother's invention. And the company was originally called Vernon Specialties. And it turns out the term specialties is sometimes a technical term used for heating, ventilating, and air conditioning companies called the pipe fitting specialties. So they said, all right, we got to come up with a better name. So then they came up with Lillian Vernon Specialties, because the company was in Mount Vernon, New York, right outside of New York City, just north of the Bronx. And that became a mouthful. So the word specialties got dropped off and it became Lillian Vernon. So that was all my mother's brainchild. She got the goods that she was selling, the products, from my grandfather. He manufactured it. She came up with the brilliant idea in those days of putting your initials on the product so that you could get a pocketbook or a belt and your initials would be on it. So it would be personalized, and therefore not something you could just find in a department store, because that didn't exist in the department store. So that really what launched the business. And fortunately, the first ad ever placed was in 17 magazine. I still have a copy. Ad cost $495. And later, when I joined the business, if you spend $500 on an ad, if we did $1,000, $1,200, that would be good. That ad produced $32,000 in sales, which was the best ad we ever ran. And as a result, launched the business. Had it not, I don't know where that business would have been today.
Well, was the products that were sold through that business, were they all domestically produced then, or did you at some point in time have to start buying from other countries?
They were all domestically produced. I would say they started to go overseas sometime in the mid-'70s, about when I joined the company. And partly it was, how do we find products that you could not find at JCPenney or Sears Roebuck or other Populous or Montgomery Ward? So that's where the idea came from of, all right, let's see if we can import some products that would be unique, different, refreshing, and actually we were able to buy them at attractive prices because we were the direct importer, and then there was no middleman. So we actually provided a more economical product and a unique product.
So that was a kind of your first entry into trade in a sense, basically, and that's one of the elements of trade, right? Is to expand the capacity and choice and potentially competitively priced products for American consumers. That's a benefit of trade.
Without question. And I think sometimes what we sort of forget, maybe we'll get into this later, we were a big importer, but we've also learned over time, I certainly learned in working for President Obama, we're a giant export powerhouse as well. And I think sometime in the current discussion, we forget that part because we keep talking about what we're going to import and put tariffs, but not thinking about, hey, we need to sell to these people as well.
Well, here at the World Food Prize, obviously, trade is incredibly important because it's one of the strategies for trying to get food to where it's needed and to the people who need it most. And we still deal with a fairly significant number of people worldwide that are food insecure. You had some experience in government before you served in the Obama administration. In fact, I think that's where we first crossed paths, if I'm not mistaken. I was a governor, and I think you were working for the SBA at that time. What were your responsibilities with reference to SBA? And did you find that the small businesses that you were involved with there also had a trade component, or were reliant on trade either for the materials that they needed or for what they sold?
So, yes, I served under President Clinton, first as the number two, as the deputy administrator at the Small Business Administration, and then for a short while, the acting administrator. Some of us may recall the 2000 election was a very protracted process. So I served as the acting administrator. The small business I met, it was one of the best parts of the job, is meeting entrepreneurs, meeting business people, learning about unique products that they make that you would never have imagined so much ingenuity and innovation coming from small business owners around the country. I would say one of the big changes I noticed, that I was at the Small Business Administration in the late 90s, joined President Obama's administration in 2009. And in that, say, decade change, one thing I did notice when I was in business, we would sort of look to exhaust the local market and then think about exporting. And what I found differently in the early 2000s was that people were thinking about exporting almost from the start, that companies were making a product and said, is there an export market here? So that was one of my surprises when I got to the Export-Import Bank in the United States, is how many small businesses were actively engaged in exporting and made it integral to their initial strategy.
Well, let's talk about this creature called the Export-Import Bank. Truth be told, I had no idea what that was prior to the time I started working for the Obama administration. So if you were talking to the man or woman on the street, how would you have explained it to them in a way that most of us would understand? What is it? What does it do?
So actually, just quick history, the Export-Import Bank was actually started by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the depths of the Depression. And FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, realized we got to put more people back to work. We had as much as 25% unemployment in the 1930s. And why aren't we exporting? Well, sometime it's because companies don't have the financing to be able to export overseas, or are afraid of what if I don't get paid from an overseas buyer? So FDR and Jesse Jones, who was a businessman and a supporter of the president from Houston, came up with the idea of, if we could find a way to help finance those exports, we would support more U.S. jobs. So that's where it came from. And today, the Export-Import Bank does, when I was there, over 90% of the transactions, 90% of the deals we did were small businesses. And frequently, it's either providing working capital loans, or the Export-Import Bank will sell credit insurance. So, if you're in Iowa and you're selling goods to Indiana, and the customer doesn't pay in Indiana, it's not that hard, state to state, to enforce a debt and make sure that someone pays. A little harder if you're in Iowa and you're shipping to Guatemala or Colombia or Brazil. How do I collect? So the Export-Import Bank over time, and a lot of what we did for small businesses and a lot in the food industry was, we'll sell you an insurance policy. If your customer overseas doesn't pay, we will make good and we will enforce the debt. And one thing I did learn, because people said, well, isn't that risky? Companies don't like the default on the U.S. government. It's not a good idea. We have ways of collecting. And I used to joke, but it's true. We have an Army, we've got a Navy, we've got the Air Force. I mean, in the early days, when they talked about gunboat diplomacy, part of that was to enforce debts. So the United States has a pretty good record of collecting on debts. And also, when foreign buyers realized that the Export-Import Bank was guaranteeing the loan, they did not want to mess with the U.S. government, and they tended to pay, so they didn't even need the insurance. But the fact the insurance was there actually enforced better behavior on the part of buyers.
Recently, the Export-Import Bank has broadened its portfolio to include apparently investments in actual businesses as part of an effort to try to jumpstart our critical minerals push. Did that surprise you? Do you have concerns about that? Do you think that's a good policy?
It surprised me enormously. I actually called some folks at the I said, how the hell are we doing this? I didn't think we could do something like that. Turns out it is called the Export-Import Bank. And so in the original charter, going back to the 1930s, the Export-Import Bank has a authority to also support imports. So in that sense, it was, I don't think, hardly ever used in the last 80, 90 years, but that statute exists, and as a result, they're creating a facility so the United States can import critical minerals and create sort of a bank that they could then be used domestically. They had to be imported and used domestically. And it's basically like a credit facility that makes sure there's enough liquidity to bring those critical minerals in, just like we have the Strategic Oil Reserve to make sure there's that supply that we don't actually run dry.
How big is the portfolio? Where does the money come from to finance all of this?
So two areas. Congress, when they authorize the Export-Import Bank, allows it to have a certain amount of debt on its books. About $150 billion is the cap, $130 billion. It is far, far less right now. There's been more activity in this critical minerals area. There's been more activity finding ways to compete with China. And I would say one of the things I've learned lately is there seems to be less support of exports than there was when I was there. Only in the range of $5 or $6 billion a year. When I was the chairman in the 2009, 10, 11, right after the global financial crisis, we were doing $35, $36 billion a year, some years in the $20 billion. So it's a little less than it was, a lot less, in fact, than it was in the heyday of those exports.
What was the extent, if any, of the work that was done in the food and agriculture space? Did the Ex-Im Bank get involved in food and ag and commodities? Is that part of the portfolio as well?
It is. So, as you know, obviously from the Department of Agriculture, there's the Commodities Credit Corporation, which is the first place that people go, farmers go, exporters go to get credit to export their products. When the Commodities Credit Corporation hits a ceiling, either by product category or country, we could take care of the overage. So the first place we would tell anybody, you need to go to the Department of Agriculture. And if they run out of financing capacity, we would step in. But we also stepped in on more finished products, whether it be mustards, pickles, peanut butter, things like that have been processed here in the United States. And we supported those exports as well.
A lot of discussion recently about tariffs, and a lot of different authorities, obviously, for the assessment of tariffs. Talk to me a little bit about what you learned about tariffs and what you found out about tariffs as you were working on your book, and the role that they could play in either facilitating trade or potentially acting as a barrier to trade.
Well, I'm not a big fan of tariffs, period, because they're like a brake, and they are certainly a tax, as the Supreme Court just announced several days ago. There's no question it is a tax, and it is a tax on consumers. But tariffs could have a role to play if you're saying, well, we want to make sure, and frankly, in the founding of our country, tariffs played a role to make sure that industry, particularly in weaving and metalwork after this Revolutionary War, could get up to speed and compete with countries like the United Kingdom and Great Britain. So tariffs, I think, in a defined area in a short period of time to give American companies, American business people an opportunity to get on their feet and be able to compete globally, there's a role for that. Long term, I think that they impede trade, they impede innovation. One of the things that makes this country great is we have welcomed in exports. It has made our lives richer in terms of more variety, certainly in the food area, enormously so, that we can get a variety of foods, vegetables, 12 months a year, 365 days a year. Whether you're living in Alaska or Florida, you can enjoy strawberries, blueberries, avocados, and all those kinds of things. So there is a role. I think that we've been using tariffs lately in a more punitive way, in a way of extracting concessions out of different countries. that's not really the same as saying, let's give American companies a chance to get up to speed before they have to compete globally.
So you decided to write a book after being convinced that there was actually something to it. Take me through the process of what conclusions you reached in writing the book about trade and people's understanding and appreciation or lack of appreciation and understanding about trade generally.
Well, one of the surprises, I would say, I actually, as I was working on the book, and I had this fellowship at Harvard University Institute of Politics, one of the things all of us, all the fellows did, we actually went and met with fifth graders. And these fifth graders, they're 10 years old, were asking me about supply chains and asking about imports. And I went like, I didn't know any of that when I was 10 years old. And I would say one of the surprises in writing the book, the term people we now use is value chains, because it's not just getting widgets overseas, it's actually importing technology and so forth. So there is a greater sense of that. And, when I wrote the book, I had to explain the supply chain. By the time the book came out with COVID and everything else, Americans were fully familiar what supply chains were, why they were causing bottlenecks at the ports, why they were raising costs. So we've become far more knowledgeable about that. But the idea of the book, as trade is not a four-letter word, I just felt in the 2016 election, in particular, all of a sudden trade became a bad thing. And one, from my personal family's business, I didn't understand that. And I think our lives have been richer because of the imports. Of course, there have been many communities and many industries that got badly hurt and hollowed out. And we did a bad job as a country to really recognize that early enough and find remedies. But that doesn't mean trade is terrible. That just means we didn't really put in sort of the guardrails to sort of support people while we were going through this rapid transition.
Well, your supply chain was really, really short when you were conducting that business when you were a child. It was just
Very
your
short.
very short, right? But the supply chains that have been built over the last 30, 40 years are fairly complicated and cover long and significant distances. What do you think is going to happen in light of the assessment of tariffs, the sort of the transactional nature of things now in terms of supply chains? Are they going to continue to be fairly geographic? Are they going to be regional? Are they going to be continent to continent? What do you see in terms of the change, if any, in supply chains?
Well, there's a lot of talk about friend sharing and near shoring as well as reshoring. And part of that is if we're buying products or components from Mexico and Canada, to name two of our adjacent countries, there's a greater ability, certainly like in the auto industry, to use American parts, Canadian parts, and Mexican parts. And as a result, I believe American cars are far more competitive globally because we've combined both the cost structure, the innovation, and the ingenuity of three countries and people in three different countries producing those cars. But they're far more complicated today than they ever were. And just, I know we're talking about food, but I'll give you just an example about value chains. I went down to Monterrey, Mexico when I was working on the book, and there are a lot of auto manufacturing components that come out of Monterrey, Mexico. Now, if you are supplying shock absorbers or other things to Ford 150 trucks and so forth, you have to agree, if you're going to manufacture that you're going to make that product for at least 14 years after the last model rolls off the assembly line. So these are not something you can easily just move around more easily. You can move around commodities, and we've seen this, and Tom, you've seen this, we've tried to sell more soybeans, for example, to China. China gets angry of us, they start buying from Brazil. It's not as hard for them to move their supply chain around on a commodity than a more finished product. So those are some of the complexities that I think we're seeing these days.
The way you structured the book was interesting. You wanted to connect it to ordinary folks by pointing out maybe some things that they would never have connected to trade, products that they would never connect to trade. Tell me a little bit about the thought process behind that and how you structured the book.
Well, so I tried to pick 6 products that tried to explain trade. Everything from the taco bowl, which, by the way, was invented here in America People think it's Mexican, but it's not. Just like corned beef and cabbage was invented in the United States because there were a lot of Irish immigrants who missed being home, and so they came up with the idea of corned beef and cabbage. It did not exist in Ireland. It started here. The taco bowl actually was invented here, invented at Disney World, not in Mexico. So we've often imported ideas and created new products and new foods as a result. So that's one of the things I learned. And I just think there were so many products. And what I think I didn't have a full understanding or appreciation of is services play a major role in our trade. And services being tourism, higher education, college educations, those kinds of things. Obviously, financial products, insurance. But we actually run a trade surplus in services. We run a deficit in manufactured goods. And frankly, until recently, we ran a surplus in agriculture products. And lately, we're now running a deficit. We didn't for many years. Only in the last 4 or 5 years or 3 years are we actually running a deficit when it comes to agriculture products.
So I get really confused and a little bit befuddled by this discussion of deficits because I read on the one hand that, we are importing more than we export of goods and services combined, and we have a trade deficit. But then I read from economists that they say, well, that's really not the full story. There's more to it than that. There's investment that's made by foreign entities into the United States that supports our economy. And if you take it all into consideration, we're sort of operating at a surplus. So which is it? Do we have a deficit or don't we?
First of all, I don't think trade deficits matter that much, to be number one. Number two, you're absolutely right. Foreign direct investment, people love acronyms, FDI. If you're exporting a car, it's very easy. You have a serial number, you know exactly what's going. If you're exporting soybeans, you know how many tons are going through the port. Services are a foreign student comes to study in America, and she or he pays tuition. So that's a service export. They're getting an education and they're coming from overseas. But then you say, well, what about what they spend on the dorm? What about what they spend on airline travel? What about what they spend on McDonald's? It gets harder to understand how the services begin to get harder to track. So I think if we really, because there's not as great accuracy on services, if you add in the services, and as you suggested, add in the investment here, we are running a surplus. We were the largest product exporter about 20 years ago. We're now at number 2, only behind China. And frankly, they don't do a lot of service exports. People are not going to China to study. People are not going to China in the same way to vacation and so forth. And those are great service exports. Disney World is a great service export. I live in Florida. It's one of the largest sources of tourist income in the United States. And regrettably, right now, we have less foreigners coming to America, less tourists coming to America, partly just the fear of what would happen to them, the fear about if they're a tourist, would they be apprehended? Would they be seen in the same way? So I think we are actually hurting our service exports. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we're hurting our commodity exports.
So let me ask you something about this. The World Food Prize each year awards the World Food Prize. It's been doing this this is our 40th year anniversary of the prize, and we surround it with what is called the Borlaug Dialogue, where we have 2.5 days of conversation about food security, nutrition security, best practices here and around the world. We bring people in from 50 to 60 countries to participate in this conference. They come to Des Moines. They stay here for several days. They obviously do a little bit of tourism. They obviously eat at restaurants. Is that part of the equation here as we talk about the issue of trade deficits and surpluses and so forth? Things like this that the United States has that attracts people to it should be considered when we talk about whether or not there's actually whether trade is really something that's a negative or a positive.
You're absolutely right. I mean, all those businesses, all those people who come to the World Food Prize in Des Moines, that's an export, all that travel. Now, sometimes it's harder to track because, say you change some currency and you start paying cash for a dinner or a restaurant or taxis, so it doesn't show up as a service export, but frankly, it is a service export because it's a foreigner who's doing that. So that's why I say I don't know that we capture that data as completely as we do a product. So, but when you add that in, as you said earlier about investment in America, it's an important thing. And I think we need to remind people when we're being very tough on countries that are exporting to America, we have to remember we want to export to them. That's why it's called trade, not sales. It's trade. We're selling you things, we're buying things. People want to see it going both ways, not just a sales call.
Just one last question in the interest of time, Fred. This has gone by so quickly. What did you learn about yourself or about trade that surprised you when you put the pen down and finished writing the book?
I think I've always preferred to be a student than a teacher. And so writing the book, was sort of gobbling up information. And what I think was, it reminded me, and I thank my parents for this, for being a curious person. Because as a curious person, I learned a lot in writing the book, and it sort of kept me going as trying to find more things. I would say one of the things I never will forget when I was in high school and certainly in college, and I realize it now as talking to you, is I would want to see research and do more reading and more reading. And I never spent enough time writing. I did too much time researching. And even today, thinking about our conversation, I wanted to do more and more research to sort of be more knowledgeable and more up to date. So that's one of the things I learned about myself. And sometimes it's important at some point to stop, pull back, and just assess what I've learned versus just keep saying, I need to learn more, I need to learn more. I think the other thing I learned about trade, certainly on the service side, as I mentioned to you, and the fact is, I think our country has been richer from the trade we've been doing, the importing and exporting. One of the things that separates us from China, we have actually welcomed imports, and it's made our cars better, our foods better, more variety in our stores, and opened up us to the rest of the world. A country like China would like to make everything themselves. They have their concept China 2025. Last year was, how much can we make here and never buy from the outside? I think ultimately that does not bring about the greatest innovation, the greatest creativity. And that's what's made this country so great. Our innovation, our creativity, welcoming people from abroad to come here with ideas and build businesses and contribute to this country.
Fred Hochberg, really appreciate the time. Encourage folks to take a look at the book, Trade, Not a Four-Letter Word, and certainly there it is right there in its second and perhaps soon to be third printing. So Fred, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the World Food Prize podcast. If today's conversation inspired you, we invite you to take the next step. By making a gift, you help support dialogue like this, elevate innovative solutions, give voice to science, and invest in the next generation of leaders working to end hunger. Visit worldfoodprize.org to donate, learn more, and get involved. Together, through dialogue and action, we can sustainably feed the world.